If you've ever felt embarrassed for tearing up over a movie scene, a song, or even a stressful conversation, I want you to know something. You aren't weak. Maybe you've looked around the room, noticed nobody else was crying, and immediately tried to hide your face. Maybe someone has laughed and said, "Why are you crying?" Or worse, "It's not even that serious." And suddenly, the emotion you were already trying to manage becomes something you're ashamed of. So you wipe your eyes, you take a breath, you tell yourself to get it together. But what if I told you that crying easily isn't necessarily a glitch in your personality? What if instead it can be connected to the way your brain processes sensory information, emotional cues, stress, and even the feelings of the people around you? Because sometimes the person who cries first isn't the person who feels the least in control. They may actually be processing more. And today, we're going to find out why. This is Mind Unraveled, Case File. Number 007. The hidden psychology behind people who cry easily. Let's begin. Have you ever noticed how strange it can feel when your reaction seems bigger than everyone else's? Someone says something slightly emotional, and suddenly, your eyes start burning. You hear a song you haven't listened to in years, and somehow you're fighting back tears before you even understand why. Or maybe you're watching a movie, and a character you've never met loses someone they love. Everyone else is sitting there eating popcorn, and you're sitting there thinking, why am I actually crying right now? The instinct is usually to assume something is wrong. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you're too emotional. Maybe you don't have enough control over yourself. But psychology gives us a much more interesting possibility. Your brain may simply be processing the world with greater emotional depth. And one concept that helps explain this is called sensory processing sensitivity. Now, this doesn't mean someone has a disorder. It isn't a diagnosis. It's a personality trait describing people who tend to process sensory and emotional information more deeply. Think about your brain like a filter. Every second, you're receiving an enormous amount of information. Sounds, facial expressions, body language, the atmosphere in a room, the tone someone uses when they speak, the tiny change in someone's expression when you mention something uncomfortable. Most of this information gets filtered out. But for someone with higher sensory processing sensitivity, more of those details may actually register. And that's where things get interesting, because you aren't just experiencing the obvious event. You're experiencing everything surrounding it. Imagine you're sitting at work. Your boss says, "Can we talk?" That's it. 3 words. For one person, it's nothing. They walk into the office, have the conversation, and move on. But someone who processes emotional information more deeply might notice the tone, the pause before the sentence, the expression on their boss's face, the tension in the room, the possibility that something is wrong. Their brain starts connecting all those little signals, and suddenly, a simple conversation feels enormous. That doesn't mean they're being dramatic. It means their brain has more information to process. And when enough emotional information accumulates, the body eventually has to respond. Sometimes that response is tears. And here's the part people often misunderstand. Crying isn't always about sadness. You can cry because you're overwhelmed. You can cry because you're relieved. You can cry because you're angry and don't know where to put the emotion. You can cry because something beautiful finally broke through a wall you didn't realize you'd built. The emotion doesn't always have to be negative. Sometimes, the tears are simply evidence that something mattered. And that brings us to the second piece of the puzzle. Because sometimes, you're not even crying because of what happened to you. You're crying because of what happened to someone else. You see someone break down, and suddenly, your own eyes fill with tears. You watch someone receive terrible news, and you feel their pain in your own chest. You hear someone tell a story about losing a parent. And even though you've never experienced that loss yourself, something inside you reacts as if you have. This is where empathy and emotional contagion become important. Human beings are built to pick up emotional signals from other people. We watch faces, we listen to voices, we read body language, and our brains automatically respond to what we see. You've probably experienced this without realizing it. Someone yawns, and suddenly you yawn. Someone starts laughing, and you start smiling. Someone becomes visibly anxious, and before they've even explained what's wrong, you feel the tension in the room. Emotion can spread. And for highly empathetic people, that emotional resonance can become especially powerful. This is sometimes discussed alongside the brain's mirror neuron system. But here's an important distinction. Mirror neurons aren't some magical crying button in your brain. The science is much more complicated than that. What we do know is that humans have mechanisms that help us understand and resonate with other people's actions and emotional states. And when that emotional resonance is strong, someone else's pain can become emotionally real to you. That's why you might cry when someone else cries. Not because you're fragile, but because your brain isn't simply observing their emotion, it's responding to it. And maybe that's why you've sometimes wondered, why am I this affected by things that aren't even happening to me? Because empathy doesn't always ask permission. Sometimes it just happens. And when you're constantly absorbing your own emotions, while also picking up on the emotions around you, something eventually has to give. This brings us to the third piece of the puzzle, the physiological release valve. Your body has a very complicated relationship with stress. When something feels threatening, overwhelming, or emotionally intense, your nervous system doesn't simply sit there and wait for you to explain what's happening. It reacts. Your heart rate can increase. Your muscles can tense. Your breathing can change. Stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol become part of the body's response. And for a while, you might be able to hold everything together. You keep working. You keep talking. You keep smiling. You tell everyone you're fine, but your nervous system doesn't necessarily believe you. Because there's a difference between saying you're okay and actually being okay. Imagine someone has had a terrible week. Deadlines are piling up. They're arguing with someone they love. They're barely sleeping. They're worried about money. And somehow, they keep functioning. They go to work. They answer messages. They laugh with their friends. They push everything down. Then one evening, someone asks them a completely ordinary question. Are you okay? And they start crying. Now, from the outside, it looks ridiculous. The question wasn't painful. Nothing terrible happened in that exact moment. So why the tears? Because the question wasn't the cause. It was the final opening. The emotional load had already been building. The body had been carrying stress for days. And eventually, the system reached a point where maintaining control became harder than releasing the emotion. That's one reason crying can feel strangely relieving. It can accompany a shift from intense emotional arousal toward regulation and recovery. And this is important. We shouldn't oversimplify this by saying that crying literally flushes stress hormones out of your body. Human physiology doesn't work that neatly, but crying can be part of a broader process through which emotional arousal is expressed and regulated. In other words, sometimes your tears aren't telling you that you're falling apart. They're telling you that you've been holding yourself together for too long. And that's where we need to challenge one of the biggest assumptions about people who cry easily. The assumption that emotional expression equals emotional weakness. Because it doesn't. Think about it. Someone can cry easily and still be incredibly resilient. Someone can cry during an argument and still know exactly what they're feeling. Someone can tear up when they see another person suffering and still make rational decisions. Crying is an emotional response. It isn't an intelligence test. It isn't a measurement of maturity. And it certainly isn't proof that someone can't handle life. In fact, sometimes the bigger problem isn't feeling too much. It's never allowing yourself to feel anything at all. Because when emotions are constantly suppressed, they don't necessarily disappear. They can show up as irritability, emotional exhaustion, withdrawal, tension, overthinking, or that strange feeling where you know something is wrong, but you can't explain what it is. So maybe the better question isn't, why do I cry so easily? Maybe it's, what is my mind trying to tell me when I do? Because tears can sometimes reveal information. They can tell you that something mattered, that something hurt, that you're overwhelmed, that you've connected with someone else's experience, or that you've finally reached the emotional limit you've been pretending you didn't have. And this is where sensitivity can become an advantage. Not because every sensitive person automatically has higher emotional intelligence. That's too simplistic. But because emotional sensitivity can give you access to information that other people might overlook. You may notice when someone's mood changes. You may recognize tension before anyone says there's a problem. You may understand when a friend says, "I'm fine," but doesn't actually mean it. You may catch yourself becoming overwhelmed before the situation becomes unbearable. And if you learn how to understand those signals instead of being ashamed of them, sensitivity becomes information, not a weakness, information. Think about emotional awareness like having a dashboard inside your mind. Most people don't look at the dashboard until the warning light is flashing. But if you're highly sensitive, you might notice the smaller signals earlier. The tension, the exhaustion, the emotional discomfort, the subtle change in someone's voice, the urge to cry, the feeling that something isn't right. That doesn't mean you have to obey every emotion. It means you can listen to it. There's a difference between being controlled by your emotions and being aware of them. And perhaps that's the real lesson behind crying easily. You don't need to become less emotional. You need to become better at understanding what your emotions are communicating. Because the goal isn't to stop yourself from crying. The goal is to know why you're crying. Is it sadness, overwhelm, empathy, relief, anger, grief, joy, or simply the release of something you've been carrying for far too long? Once you understand the signal, you can decide what to do with it. And maybe that's why the people who cry easily aren't always the people who need to toughen up. Sometimes, they're the people who need to stop apologizing for noticing what others ignore. So let's put the entire case together. First, sensory processing sensitivity can help explain why some people process emotional and environmental information more deeply. Second, empathy and emotional contagion can make another person's emotions feel surprisingly close to your own. And third, crying can accompany the body's response to emotional overload and its attempt to regulate intense arousal. 3 different mechanisms. 1. Visible reaction. Tears. So if you've ever been embarrassed because you cried during a movie, or because someone else's pain affected you, or because one tiny question finally broke through everything you'd been holding together, remember this: you are not automatically weak. You are not automatically unstable. And you are not broken. You may simply be someone whose emotional system notices a lot. And the goal isn't to turn the volume down on your humanity. It's to learn how to control the volume without muting the music entirely. So don't apologize for being tuned in to a frequency others ignore. And if you've ever been called too sensitive or weak because you cry easily, tell me your story in the comments. What happened? And what did people say to you? Let's unravel it together, because sometimes the tears aren't the mystery, they're the clue. Case file number 007 is almost closed. But remember, every mind leaves clues.